Andrew Harrison was 42 years old when he decided to leave the suffocating pace of city life and start anew in a quiet, unassuming town in rural America. His dream had always been simple: a house with character, a sprawling yard where he could finally relax after years of relentless work, and the chance to build something that truly felt like his own. The property he found seemed perfect. A large, two-story home with an expansive backyard and a weathered, old barn tucked in the corner of the lot. It had history, charm, and the kind of quiet solitude that Andrew had craved for years. To him, it wasn't just a house. It was a promise of peace and a fresh start. The locals had been pleasant enough when he moved in. Polite smiles, a few casual welcomes, but nothing overly intrusive or relief after years of noisy neighbors and city drama. Among the handful of people who introduced themselves early on was his next-door neighbor, Harry Holton. In his mid-50s, Harry was a tall man with a confident demeanor that bordered on imposing. His handshake was firm, and his smile seemed genuine, but there was something about the way his eyes lingered on Andrew's yard that gave him pause. Harry was the type of man who carried himself as though he owned everything he looked at. "I'm glad to see someone moving in," Harry said during their first meeting, standing just a little too close to the property line. "This place has a lot of history, you know. My grandfather used to own a good chunk of this land. The barn over there? That was part of the original trading post back in the day. It's a real shame what's happened to it over the years." Andrew nodded politely, unsure of how to respond. Harry didn't seem to require much of a reply, though. He went on to reminisce about his family's connection to the area, weaving stories of how the land had once been bustling with activity, a community hub where farmers brought their goods to trade. "You've got something special here, Andrew," Harry said, clapping him on the shoulder with a familiarity that felt a bit premature. "It's a part of history. You'll see." At first, Andrew chalked it up to small-town friendliness. Harry's stories were interesting, and his pride in the area was evident. But as the days turned into weeks, the neighbors' frequent appearances began to feel less like casual visits and more like inspections. Harry always seemed to have a reason to linger near the property line, pointing out old landmarks and sharing unsolicited advice on how Andrew should honor the land's legacy. One afternoon, Andrew found Harry in his backyard unannounced, standing near the barn and examining a rusted metal sign that had been hidden in the overgrown grass. The faded lettering read, "No trespassing." "Found this while I was walking around," Harry said casually, as though he had every right to be there. "Must been from years ago. Funny, isn't it? This whole area used to be open to everyone. Feels wrong for it to be fenced off now." Andrew forced a tight smile, his patience beginning to wear thin. "I appreciate the history lesson, Harry, but I'd prefer if you didn't wander onto the property without asking." Harry didn't apologize. Instead, he laughed a low, knowing chuckle. Sure. Just thought you'd like to know what you're sitting on. It's more than just a yard, Andrew. It's part of something bigger." After that, Andrew began to notice other oddities. Small things at first: footprints in the soft soil near the back fence, as though someone had been pacing there. A neighbor mentioning in passing that Harry had been talking about the good old days when the land was a community space. Once, Andrew came home to find a handful of small wooden stakes hammered into the ground near the barn, their purpose unclear. When he asked Harry about them, the man shrugged and said, "Just thought it'd be good to mark where the old market used to be. People around here still remember, you know." Andrew started keeping the gates locked and avoided unnecessary interactions with Harry. He wanted to give the man the benefit of the doubt. After all, not every neighborly quirk was a sign of trouble. But there was an undercurrent to Harry's behavior that Andrew couldn't ignore. It was as if Harry believed the land was still his, despite the deed in Andrew's name. The first real confrontation came a month after Andrew moved in. He was working on clearing some brush near the barn when Harry appeared at the fence, leaning on it like he owned the place. "Hey, Andrew," he called out, a little too cheerfully. "I've been thinking. You know, back in the day, this barn was the center of everything around here. My grandfather used to store goods there for the market. It wouldn't take much to get something like that going again, a little farmer's market, right here on the weekends." The whole town would love it. Andrew wiped the sweat from his brow and straightened up, already annoyed. That's not really what I had in mind for this place, Harry. I bought it for peace and quiet, not for running a market. Harry's smile faltered, just for a moment. Oh, come on. It'd be good for the community. And honestly, it's what this place was meant for. You don't want to let history die, do you? Andrew's jaw tightened. I'm not interested, Harry. This is my property and I'll decide how it's used. For a moment, Harry's expression darkened, his easygoing demeanor slipping, just enough to reveal the man beneath. Of course, he said, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. Your property. For now. That night, Andrew lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that Harry's words had been more than just a throwaway comment. Something about the man's tone had felt like a warning, a promise of trouble to come. He didn't know what Harry was planning, but one thing was certain. This was not going to be the quiet life he had hoped for. Andrew had almost convinced himself that Harry's veiled comments and odd behavior were nothing more than the quirks of an overzealous neighbor, but everything changed one Friday evening. After a long week, Andrew decided to take a short trip out of town for the weekend. By the time he returned on Sunday afternoon, something was clearly wrong. As he pulled into his driveway, the first thing he noticed was the noise. The usual calm of his property was replaced by the hum of engines, bursts of laughter, and a chorus of voices calling out prices. Confused, Andrew stepped out of his car and stared at the scene before him. His yard, his sanctuary, had been completely transformed into what could only be described as a full-scale farmer's market. Tents and makeshift stalls lined the driveway and backyard. Crates of produce, homemade goods, and random trinkets were piled high on tables. Trucks were parked haphazardly across the lawn, their tailgates open as vendors sold items straight from the back. Strangers wandered freely across his property, some even leaning against his barn, as though they'd done it 100 times before. Andrew stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what he was seeing. His first instinct was to check the property line, but it was immediately clear this wasn't a mistake. The market was fully entrenched, and whoever had organized it had done so with deliberate intent. Furious, he began weaving his way through the crowd, dodging shoppers who barely acknowledged his presence. Near the center of the chaos, Andrew found Harry. The man was standing behind a stall, cheerfully chatting with a customer as he handed over a jar of homemade jam. He didn't even flinch when Andrew stormed up to him. "Harry, what the hell is this?" Andrew demanded, his voice cutting through the noise. Harry turned to him, unfazed. "Andrew, welcome back." He gestured around him as though showcasing a masterpiece. "Beautiful, isn't it? Just like the old days. The market's back where it belongs." Andrew's blood boiled. "What are you talking about? This is my property. You had no right to set this up here." Harry shrugged, his easygoing demeanor unshaken. "Relax, Andrew. It's just a weekend thing. Nobody's hurting anything. The community's been asking for this for years, it's tradition. Figured you wouldn't mind." "Wouldn't mind?" Andrew's voice rose. "You didn't even ask me. You just decided to take over my yard like you own it. Get everyone out of here, now." Harry's smile faltered for the first time, and a flicker of irritation crossed his face. "Andrew, you're overreacting. This is good for the town. People need this market. Besides, if we're being honest, this land has always been a community space. My grandfather ran the market here for decades. It's part of our history." Andrew stepped closer, his fists clenched. "I don't care about your history. This is private property, and you're trespassing. Shut it down, or I'll call the police." The crowd around them had begun to notice the commotion, and a few vendors paused to watch the exchange. Harry's expression darkened, but he didn't back down. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a quieter, more menacing tone. "You don't get it, do you?" he said. "This land isn't just yours. You think you can come here, throw up a fence, and erase decades of tradition. It doesn't work like that. People around here know what this place means. You don't want to make enemies, Andrew. Trust me on that." Andrew refused to flinch. "Get off my property, Harry." This is your last warning." Harry stared at him for a long moment, and then, as though nothing had happened, he turned back to his stall. "Fine. Have it your way. But you'll regret this." The words hung in the air like a threat. Andrew spent the next hour calling the police and demanding the immediate removal of the market. When the officers arrived, the crowd began to disperse reluctantly, grumbling under their breath about how the new guy was ruining everything. Harry, however, remained calm. He packed up his stall slowly, shooting Andrew a pointed look as he left. By the time the market was gone, Andrew's yard was a mess. Deep tire tracks scarred the lawn, trash littered the ground, and several pieces of furniture from his barn had been moved or damaged. He was exhausted, but relief quickly turned to unease when he spotted something near the edge of his property. Hammered into the ground just past the barn was a wooden stake with a small piece of fabric tied to it, a makeshift flag, red and frayed at the edges. It hadn't been there before. Andrew pulled it out and examined it, but it didn't tell him anything. He tossed it aside and locked the barn, making a mental note to secure the rest of his property. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Flyers for the farmers' market began appearing around town, listing Andrew's address as the location and claiming it would return the following weekend. Strangers continued to wander onto his property, confused as to why the market wasn't open. When Andrew confronted Harry about the flyers, the man feigned innocence. "I don't know who made those," he said, though the smugness in his tone suggested otherwise. "Guess people just can't wait for the next one." Andrew's patience was wearing thin. He contacted the local zoning office and the police again, filing complaints and demanding action, but the responses were lukewarm at best. The authorities seemed reluctant to get involved in what they dismissed as a civil dispute. The final straw came when Andrew returned home late one night to find a group of people standing near the barn, armed with flashlights and digging tools. He yelled at them to leave, and they scattered, but not before he noticed one of them had a map. When Andrew inspected the barn the next morning, he found fresh holes in the ground and more wooden stakes marking out sections of his yard. It was as though someone was trying to claim pieces of his land bit by bit. Desperate for answers, Andrew started digging into the property's history. He spent hours at the local records office, sifting through dusty files and faded maps. What he found was unsettling. The land had indeed been a trading post decades ago, but it was never officially registered as public property. The previous owners had left under mysterious circumstances, and the deed to the property showed no record of the easements or communal rights that Harry had mentioned. When Andrew confronted Harry with this information, the man only laughed. "Paperwork doesn't mean much around here," he said. "What matters is what people believe, and right now they believe this land belongs to all of us." Andrew realized then that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. Harry was playing a long game, one that relied on manipulating the community and creating enough doubt about Andrew's rights to the property. The man wasn't just trying to hold on to history, he was trying to rewrite it entirely. As Andrew locked his gates that night, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of a fight he hadn't asked for but could no longer avoid. Andrew's frustration boiled over as the days passed, and the situation on his property escalated from irritating to outright disturbing. Harry's casual defiance had morphed into something more calculated, and the growing tension between them was impossible to ignore. Despite Andrew's efforts to secure his land, it seemed that Harry always found new ways to push the boundaries, testing just how far Andrew was willing to go to defend what was his. It started with the stakes. After Andrew had removed the ones near his barn, more appeared, this time driven into the soil along the edges of his property line. Each stake was tied with strips of the same red fabric, fluttering like ominous markers of some invisible claim. When Andrew confronted Harry about them, his neighbor played dumb. "Must be some kids messing around," Harry said, though the smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth betrayed him. "You know how small towns are. People get curious about things like this." Andrew wasn't buying it, but with no proof that Harry was behind it, he couldn't do much beyond removing the stakes and locking the gates. However, it was clear that Harry wasn't acting alone. The flyers advertising another farmer's market appeared again, this time distributed across neighboring towns, listing Andrew's address as the venue. The language had changed. It now referred to the property as Harrison Trading Grounds, an obvious jab at Andrew's name. The weekend rolled around, and although no market materialized, a steady stream of cars cruised past Andrew's house, slowing down as if searching for something. Some drivers even parked along the street and tried to peer over his fence. One woman knocked on his door, confused and holding a shopping bag. She seemed genuinely disappointed when Andrew explained there was no market. "Are you sure it's not happening? I heard it was supposed to be here," she said, squinting at him like he was lying. Andrew's temper flared. "I don't know who told you that, but this is private property. There's no market here. Tell everyone else the same thing." The woman huffed and walked back to her car, muttering under her breath. Andrew shut the door, cursing under his own. It felt like he was fighting an invisible enemy. Every time he stopped one problem, another sprang up. The local police had been no help, brushing off his concerns as trivial, and the zoning office had yet to respond to his complaints about Harry's actions. It was starting to feel like the entire town had decided to turn a blind eye. Then, late one night, Andrew heard a commotion outside. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed across the yard, and he caught glimpses of flashlight beams darting across his property. He grabbed a flashlight of his own and stormed outside, shouting into the darkness, "Who's out there? Get off my land." The lights immediately went out, but Andrew could hear hurried footsteps retreating toward the back fence. He ran toward the barn, his heart pounding, and arrived just in time to see a figure scrambling over the fence and disappearing into the woods beyond. On the ground near the barn, he found more stakes, a pair of shovels, and what looked like a crude map drawn on the back of a grocery receipt. It was marked with symbols that seemed to correspond to various points on his property: his barn, the old well near the fence, and even the tree line at the edge of the lot. Andrew stared at the map, a cold knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't just vandalism or a prank. Whoever had been on his property was deliberately mapping it out, as if planning something. He took the map inside, his mind racing with possibilities. Was Harry behind this? And if so, what was he looking for? The old barn and the well had been mentioned repeatedly in Harry's stories about the property's history. Andrew began to suspect there was something more to this obsession with tradition. The next morning, Andrew paid a visit to the county records office. He spent hours combing through old property records, deeds, and maps, searching for anything that might shed light on Harry's claims. What he found was a tangled web of outdated documents and conflicting information. The land had indeed been part of a trading post decades ago, but there was no record of it ever being designated as public property. The deed for Andrew's property was clear. He owned the land outright, but there were gaps in the documentation, particularly around the time the trading post had closed. It seemed that parts of the property's history had been lost or deliberately omitted. Andrew also discovered something else. Several years ago, a complaint had been filed against the previous owners of his house. The complaint alleged that they were improperly using the land and refusing to allow access to certain areas, specifically the barn and the well. The case had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, but the timing was suspicious. It coincided with when Harry had first moved into the neighborhood. It seemed that Andrew wasn't the first person Harry had targeted. Armed with this new information, Andrew returned home and confronted Harry directly. He marched up to the fence separating their properties, holding the map he'd found near the barn. "You want to tell me what this is?" Andrew demanded, waving the paper in front of Harry. "And don't bother pretending you don't know. This was left on my property last night, along with a group of trespassers." Harry's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked to the map, a flicker of recognition betraying him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said coolly. "If someone was on your property, that's not my problem." Andrew took a step closer, his voice low and firm. "Cut the crap, Harry. I've done my research. I know you've been trying to claim this land for years. The stakes, the flyers, the trespassers, it's all you. So tell me, what is it you're after? What's so important that you're willing to break the law for it?" For a moment, Harry didn't respond. Then, he smiled a slow, calculated grin that sent a chill down Andrew's spine. "You're not as clueless as I thought," Harry said. "But you've got it all wrong. I'm not breaking the law, Andrew. I'm restoring what's rightfully mine." Andrew's patience snapped. "This land is mine, and I have the deed to prove it. Whatever claim you think you have, It's gone. You have no right to be here." Harry shrugged, his smile never wavering. "Maybe. But let me ask you this, how well do you really know the history of this place? Because I think you'll find that some things don't stay buried forever." The cryptic remark hung in the air as Harry turned and walked away, leaving Andrew seething. That night, as he sat at his kitchen table with the map spread out in front of him, Andrew felt a gnawing sense of unease. Harry wasn't just trying to reclaim the land for nostalgia's sake. There was something else driving him, something deeper and more dangerous. And whatever it was, Andrew knew he had to find it before Harry did. Andrew's resolve hardened as he stared at the crude map sprawled across his kitchen table. The symbols and markings, paired with Harry's cryptic comments about things not staying buried, pointed to something more sinister than just a nostalgic fixation on the property's history. If Harry was going to treat this as a game of chess, Andrew decided it was time to stop playing defensively and start making calculated moves of his own. He would uncover the truth, and whatever Harry was after, Andrew was determined to stop him. The first step was to revisit the property. Early the next morning, armed with a notebook, gloves, and a shovel, Andrew made his way to the barn and the well, the two locations that seemed to be the focal points of Harry's mysterious obsession. He started with the barn, carefully examining every corner, every weathered beam, and every loose plank. The structure was old, clearly untouched for decades aside from the occasional rummaging by previous owners. But as Andrew methodically searched the barn, he noticed something odd about the floorboards near the far wall. They creaked differently, as though something hollow lay beneath them. Andrew crouched down, pried at the edges of one of the boards with a crowbar, and lifted it. Beneath was a shallow compartment, its contents obscured by a thick layer of dirt and cobwebs. Digging through the mess, he unearthed an old wooden box, its hinges rusted but still intact. Inside, he found a collection of faded papers and photographs, yellowed with age. Most were innocuous enough receipts, handwritten letters, but one document caught his eye. It was a deed from the 1930s, detailing the transfer of ownership of the land from a local family to the town. The deed included a clause that mentioned a communal arrangement for the use of the barn and surrounding land. The wording was vague, but Andrew understood its implications. This was the proof Harry had likely been referring to. As he sifted through the rest of the papers, Andrew found a grainy photograph that made his stomach tighten. It depicted a group of men standing in front of the barn, shaking hands as if concluding a deal. One of the men was unmistakably Harry's grandfather. The others were unfamiliar, but something about their expressions, their stiff postures, and wary glances felt off. In the background of the photo, Andrew noticed a large wooden crate marked with a bold stencil, "Confiscated Goods." It was the first tangible link between Harry's family and some kind of illicit activity on the property. Andrew decided to dig deeper into the well, which had always seemed like an afterthought on the land but now took on a more ominous significance. The structure was old and partially caved in, its wooden cover rotting and splintered. He pulled it aside and shone a flashlight into the darkness below. The beam of light revealed stagnant water at the bottom, along with the faint outline of something metallic sticking out from the muck. He considered trying to retrieve it but decided against it for now. Disturbing the well without proper tools could make it collapse further. Still, the discovery of something hidden in its depths only added to the growing mystery. Over the next few days, Andrew scoured local archives for any mention of his property, the trading post, or Harry's family. He discovered that the barn had indeed been used as part of a trading network during Prohibition. Records suggested that it had been more than just a legitimate market, it was a hub for smuggling goods, possibly alcohol, through the region. Harry's grandfather had been implicated in several legal disputes over unlicensed trading, though no charges had ever stuck. The pattern was clear. The land's history was tainted, and Harry wasn't just nostalgic, he was determined to reclaim whatever legacy or fortune his family believed they were owed. As Andrew pieced together the story, Harry's behavior became increasingly erratic. The man had begun pacing the property line openly, as though daring Andrew to confront him. On one occasion, Andrew caught him standing near the well, staring at it with an almost reverent expression. When Andrew approached, Harry simply smiled and said, "You should leave that alone. Some things are better left where they are." Andrew's patience was wearing thin. That night, he decided to take a calculated risk. He contacted a local historian, Patricia Rowe, who specialized in regional landmarks and folklore. If anyone could provide clarity on the trading post's past, it was her. Patricia arrived the next afternoon, a sprightly woman in her late 50s with a sharp mind and a knack for storytelling. Together, they pored over the documents Andrew had found, cross-referencing them with Patricia's own knowledge of the area. "This clause about communal arrangements is interesting," Patricia said, tapping the old deed with a finger. "It doesn't necessarily mean the land was public property, but it does suggest there might have been some kind of informal agreement. It's vague enough that someone like Harry could twist it to suit their narrative." She paused, studying the photograph Andrew had shown her. "But this crate labeled confiscated goods raises questions. If this place was part of a smuggling operation, there could be records in federal archives. Have you considered that whatever Harry's after might be tied to something illegal?" Andrew nodded grimly. "It wouldn't surprise me, but how do I stop him? He's already convinced half the town that this land belongs to everyone, and now he's escalating flyers, trespassers, the stakes marking the property. It's like he's trying to stake a claim by sheer persistence." Patricia leaned back, her brow furrowed. "Have you looked into his recent activities? If he's trying to pull something like this off, he'll need support, legal or otherwise. Someone's helping him." The suggestion lingered in Andrew's mind long after Patricia left. That evening, he began digging into Harry's connections, searching for any hint of collusion. He discovered that Harry had recently partnered with a local real estate developer, someone who specialized in acquiring distressed or disputed properties. The connection was too convenient to ignore. Harry wasn't just acting out of personal obsession, he had a financial motive and likely stood to profit handsomely if he could wrest control of Andrew's property. As Andrew processed this revelation, the stakes were raised yet again. Late one night, he was woken by the sound of shattering glass. He bolted out of bed and found one of his kitchen windows broken, a brick lying on the floor beneath the shards. Tied to the brick was another strip of red fabric, along with a note scrawled in blocky handwriting, "Leave now, while you can." Andrew's blood ran cold. This wasn't just intimidation anymore, it was a direct threat. He reported the incident to the police, but their response was frustratingly dismissive. Without evidence tying the act to Harry, they treated it as an isolated case of vandalism. Andrew was on his own, and he knew it. The next day he decided to confront Harry again, but this time with a plan. Armed with the knowledge of Harry's partnership with the developer, Andrew approached him at the property line. "I know what you're doing," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You think you can bully me into leaving so you can sell this land. It's not going to work." Harry's grin was infuriatingly smug. "Is that what you think? You're welcome to try and stop me, Andrew. But this land has a way of taking care of itself. You might find it's more trouble than it's worth." Andrew's response was cold and deliberate. "We'll see about that. I'm not going anywhere." As Harry walked away, Andrew felt the weight of the battle ahead. The threats, the lies, the manipulation, it was all leading to something bigger. Whatever Harry was after, Andrew was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The fight for the land was no longer just about property, it was about justice, legacy, and the truth buried in its soil. The breaking point for Andrew came when he returned home late one evening to find his front gate wide open and deep tire tracks cutting through his freshly mowed lawn. His heart sank as he approached the barn, where he could hear low voices murmuring in the dark. This wasn't the first time someone had trespassed onto his property, but the brazenness of it, the utter disregard for his warnings, felt like an open challenge. Clutching his flashlight tightly, Andrew stepped into the barn, his boots crunching over broken glass and dirt. Inside, two figures were hunched over a table piled with old wooden crates. At the sound of Andrew's footsteps, they froze. One of them turned, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. Before Andrew could say a word, they bolted, sprinting past him and out into the night. He chased them as far as the property line, but they were too fast, disappearing into the trees. Breathing heavily, Andrew returned to the barn to inspect the damage. The crates had been smashed open, their contents strewn across the floor. Most of it appeared to be junk, rusty tools, rotting fabric, but among the debris, Andrew found something that made his stomach twist. It was a ledger, its leather cover cracked with age. Inside, neatly written entries detailed shipments of goods, dates, and prices. But these weren't ordinary goods. Names like Black Barrel moonshine and contraband tobacco appeared repeatedly. The entries dated back nearly a century, confirming Andrew's growing suspicion. The barn had been part of a larger smuggling operation, and whatever Harry was looking for, it was tied to this illegal past. The next morning, Andrew visited the local police station to report the trespassing and vandalism, bringing the ledger as evidence. But the response was as dismissive as ever. The officer on duty, an older man named Officer Langley, barely glanced at the ledger before shaking his head. Without clear evidence tying this to anyone specific, there's not much we can do, Langley said, his tone weary. You're dealing with a civil matter here. Maybe put up some cameras. Andrew clenched his fists, frustrated by the lack of support. Cameras won't stop this. Whoever's behind this isn't just messing around, they're digging for something. And I'm pretty sure Harry Holton is involved. Langley gave a non-committal shrug. Harry's lived here his whole life. People trust him. If you want to go after him, you're going to need more than some old papers. Andrew left the station seething, but his determination only grew stronger. Harry wasn't just testing his patience, he was escalating the conflict, and Andrew knew it was time to fight fire with fire. He spent the rest of the day installing motion detecting floodlights and reinforced locks on the barn and his gates. He also set up a trail camera near the well, hoping to catch whoever was sneaking onto his property. It didn't take long for the camera to deliver results. 2 nights later, Andrew reviewed the footage and saw a shadowy figure creeping toward the well with a flashlight. The man paused to look around before bending down to inspect the ground near the edge of the well. Although the figure's face wasn't entirely clear, Andrew recognized the distinctive posture and broad shoulders. It was Harry. He wasn't even bothering to hide his involvement anymore. Armed with the footage, Andrew returned to the police station, but the results were the same. Langley dismissed the footage as inconclusive, claiming it didn't prove intent or trespassing. Andrew realized then that he was on his own. Harry had deep roots in the community, and whatever respect or loyalty he'd built over the years was shielding him from accountability. If Andrew wanted to stop him, he would need to outthink him. Over the next few days, Harry escalated his efforts. More flyers appeared around town advertising yet another farmer's market, this time with promises of heritage tours and live demonstrations on Andrew's property. Strangers began showing up unannounced, wandering through his yard with cameras, as though it were some kind of historical site. When Andrew confronted one of them, the man shrugged and said, "We heard this was a public event. Didn't Harry tell you?" Furious, Andrew decided to take the fight to Harry directly. He waited until Harry was out tending his garden and walked up to the fence, holding the ledger in one hand and his phone in the other. "You want to explain this?" Andrew said, waving the ledger. Harry glanced up, his expression calm but watchful. "I don't know what you're talking about." Andrew stepped closer, his voice rising. "This ledger, the smuggling operation, the people digging up my yard. I've had enough of your games, Harry. You think you can scare me off with your little stunts? It's not going to work." Harry's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've got quite the imagination, Andrew. Maybe you should take a break. Get out of town for a while. Clear your head." Andrew's blood boiled. "Is that a threat?" Harry leaned against the fence, his gaze unflinching. "It's advice. But if you're too stubborn to take it, that's your choice. Just remember you can't fight the past. It always comes back." Andrew stormed away, but Harry's words lingered in his mind. There was something unnerving about his confidence, as though he knew something Andrew didn't. That night, Andrew received his answer. A certified letter arrived in the mail, stamped with the insignia of the local zoning board. The letter claimed that a formal complaint had been filed against Andrew for unauthorized use of a historical site. The complaint alleged that Andrew's actions clearing brush, locking the barn, and refusing public access were in violation of local preservation laws. It was clear Harry was behind it, using his influence to weaponize the system against Andrew. Furious but undeterred, Andrew contacted Patricia Rowe, the historian he'd worked with earlier. Together, they began digging deeper into the legalities of the property and the zoning laws Harry was trying to manipulate. Patricia discovered a critical flaw in Harry's claim. The preservation laws he cited only applied to officially designated landmarks, and the barn didn't qualify. Furthermore, the original deed made no mention of public access rights beyond the vague communal arrangement clause, which wasn't legally enforceable. As Andrew prepared to counter Harry's complaint, the harassment intensified. Late one night, his floodlights triggered, and he ran outside to find the words "This is our land" spray-painted across his barn doors in dripping red letters. It was a blatant act of intimidation, and Andrew knew Harry's patience was wearing thin. The stakes had risen, and both men were running out of room to maneuver. Andrew made one final discovery that changed everything. While reviewing the ledger, he noticed a discrepancy in the dates and entries. One shipment, marked with a red asterisk, stood out. It was listed as precious cargo, noted as being buried near the source. Andrew realized the source must mean the well. Whatever Harry was after, it wasn't just about reclaiming his family's legacy, it was about recovering something of value hidden on the property long ago. That night, as Andrew stood in his yard staring at the barn and the well, he felt a surge of determination. Harry might have the town's loyalty, but Andrew had the truth, and he was going to use it to bring Harry's plans crashing down. The battle wasn't just about the land anymore, it was about exposing Harry for who he truly was. The night was still when Andrew decided it was time to take control of the situation once and for all. For weeks, Harry had escalated his tactics, emboldened by the lack of consequences and the town's indifference. But Andrew now had enough evidence to confront him on his own terms, and he wasn't going to wait for the authorities to take action. Harry's obsession with the barn and the well wasn't just about history or tradition, it was about the ledger, the map, and whatever was buried beneath the soil. Andrew intended to find it before Harry did, no matter the risk. Armed with a crowbar, a flashlight, and a heavy-duty winch he'd rented earlier that day, Andrew made his way to the well under the cover of darkness. The trail camera he'd set up nearby had caught Harry sneaking around the well several times over the past few nights, but Andrew hadn't been able to tell exactly what he was doing. The time for guessing was over. If Harry wanted something down there, Andrew was going to get to it first. The well was even more unstable up close than Andrew had realized. Its crumbling stones seemed ready to collapse at the slightest pressure, and the rotting wooden frame creaked ominously as he removed the remains of the old cover. Shining his flashlight into the depths, Andrew saw what he'd glimpsed before, something metallic and angular protruding from the murky water. It was too deep to reach by hand, so Andrew looped the winch's hook around a sturdy nearby tree, anchored the line, and began lowering it carefully into the well. The hook caught on the object almost immediately, and Andrew cranked the winch with deliberate care. The object resisted at first, but after several tense minutes it began to rise. As the waterlogged item broke the surface, Andrew realized what he was pulling up: a large, rusted metal trunk, its sides dented and corroded by decades of decay. The lock had long since broken, leaving the lid slightly ajar. Andrew hauled the trunk onto solid ground and pried it open. Inside, he found stacks of sealed packages wrapped in oilcloth, along with a small wooden box. The packages reeked faintly of old tobacco, confirming his suspicion that this was part of the smuggling operation documented in the ledger. But it was the wooden box that drew his attention. Opening it, Andrew discovered a collection of gold coins, each marked with dates from the late 1800s. They were pristine, glittering even in the weak beam of his flashlight. This was what Harry had been after, a treasure hidden by his grandfather's smuggling operation, lost to time until now. Andrew stared at the coins, a mix of triumph and dread settling over him. He had the upper hand now, but it wouldn't take long for Harry to notice the trunk was gone. And when he did, there would be hell to pay. Andrew decided to secure the trunk in his garage and call Patricia Rowe in the morning to verify the find. He didn't trust the police to handle it properly, not when so many of them seemed to turn a blind eye to Harry's actions. Before Andrew could leave the well, he heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps behind him. He spun around, his flashlight cutting through the dark, and found himself face to face with Harry. The man's expression was a mask of fury, his usual smug demeanor replaced by raw anger. You don't know what you're messing with, Harry growled, stepping closer. His eyes darted to the trunk, and his fists clenched. That doesn't belong to you. Andrew stood his ground, gripping the flashlight tightly. It doesn't belong to you either. This land is mine, and whatever's on it is mine too. You've been trespassing, vandalizing, and threatening me for weeks. It ends here, Harry. Harry's lip curled into a sneer. Do you think this town cares about your paperwork? This land was never yours. Not really. It's part of something bigger, something you'll never understand. Andrew took a step forward, his voice low and steady. I understand plenty. I know about the smuggling. I know about the ledger. And I know you've been trying to bully me off this property because you're too much of a coward to face the truth. Whatever your family did here, it's over. Harry lunged at him, but Andrew was ready. He dodged the attack and used the flashlight as a weapon, striking Harry hard enough to knock him off balance. Harry stumbled, but the fury in his eyes didn't waver. You don't know what you've done, he spat. That gold isn't just money, it's a legacy. It's what built this town. You can't just keep it for yourself. Andrew laughed bitterly. You mean it's what your family built by breaking the law? Smuggling, lying, and cheating. That's not a legacy. That's a curse. The confrontation ended abruptly when Andrew pulled out his phone and held it up, its recording app running. Harry froze, his eyes narrowing. I've got enough evidence to bury you, Andrew said, his voice cold. The vandalism, the trespassing, the threats, it's all documented. The trunk just adds to the list. If you don't want to spend the rest of your life in court, I suggest you leave. Now. For the first time, Harry hesitated. His anger didn't fade, but the calculating glint in his eyes returned. He took a step back, his chest heaving. You think you've won, he said, his voice low. But this isn't over, not by a long shot. With that, Harry turned and disappeared into the darkness. Andrew stood there for several moments, his adrenaline still pumping. The victory felt hollow. He had diffused the immediate threat, but Harry's parting words echoed ominously in his mind. He knew the man wouldn't give up so easily. Back at the house, Andrew secured the trunk in the garage and double-checked all the locks on his doors and windows. He spent the rest of the night reviewing his evidence and preparing for whatever Harry might try next. The fight wasn't over, but Andrew was no longer the one on the defensive. He had the treasure, the documents, and the truth on his side. Tomorrow, he would take the next step, one that would ensure Harry could never touch his land again. The following morning, Andrew awoke with a sense of grim determination. Harry's parting threat still lingered in his mind, but Andrew knew he finally had the upper hand. The rusted trunk, the ledger, the gold coins, everything pointed to a story that would unravel Harry's schemes and put an end to his relentless campaign to claim the land. With the evidence safely secured, Andrew made a series of calls, ensuring the right people would be involved to handle the fallout. Patricia Rao was the first to arrive. The historian's eyes widened as she examined the coins and the trunk, her fingers brushing over the detailed entries in the ledger. This is remarkable, she said, her voice tinged with awe. This isn't just a smuggling operation, it's a piece of regional history. But it's also a Pandora's box. If Harry's grandfather hid this, there's no telling how far Harry's willing to go to keep it under wraps. Andrew nodded, his jaw tight. That's exactly why I need your help. You've got connections with the Historical Society and preservation boards. If this story gets out the right way, truthfully, Harry won't be able to twist it to his advantage. Patricia agreed to help, taking photographs of the evidence and reaching out to her network to authenticate the find. Meanwhile, Andrew prepared for the inevitable confrontation. He spent the day securing his property and ensuring all his footage, documents, and photographs were backed up in multiple locations. He wasn't going to leave anything to chance. By late afternoon, word had spread. Harry arrived uninvited, accompanied by two other men Andrew recognized from previous visitors to his property. They stood near the gate, their postures rigid, their faces set with hostility. Harry stepped forward, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, his expression somewhere between smug and menacing. You've been busy, Harry said. his voice carrying just enough to mask the venom beneath. "Found anything interesting?" Andrew didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his arms crossed over his chest. "Plenty. Enough to prove that everything you've been doing here is illegal trespassing, vandalism, and now this ridiculous attempt to reclaim a legacy built on smuggling and theft." Harry's face hardened, the mask slipping. "You don't understand what you're playing with," he snapped. "That gold belongs to my family. It built this town. You think a few documents and some old coins are going to scare me off?" Andrew smiled faintly. "I don't need to scare you. The evidence speaks for itself. The authorities will handle the rest." Harry's composure cracked. He lunged forward, but the two men at his side grabbed his arms, muttering something about not making things worse. For a moment, Andrew saw raw desperation in Harry's eyes, a man who had spent years convincing himself of a righteous cause, only to see it collapse around him. "This isn't over," Harry growled as his associates pulled him back. "You've made a big mistake." "Funny," Andrew replied coldly. "That's exactly what I was going to say to you." Harry and his men left, but Andrew didn't let his guard down. Over the next week, the local historical society and preservation boards became involved, verifying the treasure and documenting its significance. The story of the smuggling operation and its rediscovery spread quickly, drawing interest from state and even national organizations. Patricia ensured that the narrative centered on the property's history and the importance of preserving its integrity, not Harry's fabricated claims of a communal legacy. The final blow came when Andrew submitted the footage of Harry trespassing, combined with testimonies from Patricia and other neighbors who had grown tired of Harry's manipulations. A formal investigation was launched, exposing Harry's long history of shady dealings, including his partnership with the real estate developer. Charges of trespassing, harassment, and attempted fraud followed, effectively dismantling any chance Harry had of reclaiming his influence in the community. When the dust settled, Andrew stood in his yard, staring at the barn that had once been the center of so much turmoil. The scars of the conflict, tire tracks in the grass, spray paint on the barn doors reminded him of how far Harry had pushed him, but they also reminded him of his own resilience. He had stood his ground and reclaimed his peace. The town's attitude toward Andrew shifted as the truth came to light. Neighbors who had once sided with Harry began to apologize, offering help to restore the damage done to his property. While Andrew appreciated the gestures, he remained cautious. The conflict had shown him how quickly loyalty could shift, and he wasn't ready to trust blindly. In the weeks that followed, Andrew began transforming the barn into a small exhibit, working with Patricia to display the treasure and the history they had uncovered. It wasn't about the gold, it was about honoring the land for what it truly was, free of Harry's twisted claims. At the opening event, neighbors gathered, admiring the restored barn and its story. Andrew stood at the center, quietly taking it all in. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Andrew felt a rare sense of peace. The battle for his land was over, and though it had cost him sleepless nights and tested his limits, he had emerged stronger. For the first time in months, his home truly felt like his own.